Alright, welcome to part 2 of High Poly. We're getting stuck in with the skirt armor here, or the fouls. Still not sure how that's pronounced. Here we're just starting off with a box, and we're going to be turbo smoothing it into the shape of the armor. As with the previous week, we're just going to be focusing on areas that are difficult or interesting to tackle. Just using Turbo Smooth here to get the rounded shape of the armor. Just cutting in some control edges. You can see we're just doing the basic shapes and making sure they're aligning to the flow of the skirt armor. If you remember from before, in the concept sculpt, we made sure it followed the curvature of the legs and giving it a slightly feminine appearance. It looks like we've got the main basic shape in before we start cutting out. Just pushing in the crotch area here so we have this nice wrap around the leg. In the armor it has a sort of slight bulge going in around the hip, which creates a nice shape that flows down into between the legs. Just adding some more geometry as we need it. Now that we have the main shape in, we can start cutting in all the panels. Now I'm making sure the skirt armor lines up with the main torso, as the two will be held together. Just using FFDs to get that nice flow between the two. Right, now we can start cutting in the main panels. Just using quick slice to get the main cut across the skirt area. Right, now that we've got our main waist area done, we can start cutting in the actual panels of the leg. As you can see, I'm just forcing that topology flow by doing cuts straight across using quick slice. And now I'm just going to clean up around. This is where it really helps keeping the mesh nice and simple, so we can do edits like this very quickly rather than having to deal with a much more dense mesh. Here I'm just making sure each panel flows nicely around. Just adding a turbo smooth just to double check it. Here I'm just fixing this curve in here so when it turbo smooths it does it nicely. Same with the back. Got all those nice arches on the front and the back of it. Even though we turbo smooth the mesh, we can still make large edits to it using the FFDs. Just exaggerating slightly that nice pinch going in, as if the arm was almost made out of a material. Now we're doing the final cuts to the different paneling as we've got all our mesh ready. Just making sure they still line up to the skirt armor concept sculpt. And now just doing the same trick as any other lobstered area, just extruding very slightly and then going to be connecting up and cleaning the panels underneath. Here I'm just extruding back to make the panels go underneath each other. And now I'm just cleaning up the mesh underneath. As with the lobster parts, just going to be removing the connecting extrude and shifting down the edge underneath so that they look as though they overlap with each other. Right now, moving on to all the leg armor. We're going to start by making the upper thigh armor first, and then we're going to shift all the way down to the end of it. This will make it feel as though it's all part of one interconnected armor, similar to how the arm armor should feel. Just making the upper thigh with a basic cylinder, similar to how we made the bracer on the arm. Now just shift extruding down the knee pad area, just making sure we keep the nice rhythm and flow of the leg as it sweeps back into the calf. Just making sure we've got some key edges in on the top of the shin bone. And just making sure our lower leg armor wraps right nicely around the concept sculpt. Just using FFTs just to move everything into place. So you can see, just starting with very few edges here, just on the key points as it goes in and out, and we can let Turbo Smooth take care of the rest. Like with previous armor sections, we're just going to make sure we get the overall shapes of the armor in first before we start cutting in panels. Yeah, just making sure we got the pinch and then flow out of the bottom of the shin armor. Now we've got the main shapes in, I can start separating out the individual pieces of armor, starting with the thigh. Just getting in that nice triangular shape that you saw in the bracer. Once again, making sure our shape language is consistent. Just adding in a few lines to get that bulge of the thigh poking out as it rounds into the knee. So even though we're just starting with a cylinder, we want to make sure we break away from the straight up and down shape. Now I'm separating the main knee pad armour. I'm going to start off with making a central piece, and then we can extrude out and make the panelling underneath. So it's best to let the larger, more interesting places guide the rest of the smaller parts coming off of it, rather than working from small to big. So you can see in this side view the knee pad armour is tilted forward. It isn't just straight up and down, as it needs to be in a way that will flow with the knee as it bends and moves. Once again, keeping in mind those nice anatomical rhythms in your armour. Just testing out the main shape with some turbo smoothing. Just making sure our armour sits nicely on top of the body itself, that it's not pushing in too much. Here, angling the knee armour slightly just to follow the natural angle of the knee. So you can see our knee pad armour is coming together with just a few simple shapes. You want to leave enough space between the knee and the actual inside of the armour, as the knee cap will pop out slightly as the leg will bend. Once again, just keeping in mind how the body will move around inside the armour. Here, adding the pointed shape on the top and the lower middle of the armour. Once again, following that triangular shape on the tops and bottoms of pieces of armour, as seen in the gauntlet and bracer, etc. Now we've got the knee pad armour in place, we can start shifting out the underlying panels. So even though it's split into two pieces on the top and the bottom, we can just make the overall shape of each side, and then we can split it after. Once again, starting with our large shapes and then splitting down into the smaller ones. I'm just separating out each piece before we make them overlap. Here we can make the overlap more obvious by making it shell in and out as they stack on top of each other. Here I'm just pushing back the top panel so it sits slightly behind the middle one. And just making sure the thigh armor connects nicely with the knee pad panels. I'm just shifting down the panels to make sure they overlap. Just doing some tests with Turbo Smooth to make sure they all flow nicely. Here I'm adding that swept-backed pattern to the outer parts of the armor, as seen in the gauntlet. Just making sure all the ends line up together and flow nicely, as we had in the concept. Like with the top parts, I'm just pushing in and out the different panels to get a nice overlap. Just making sure there's enough underneath each one so it looks convincing, so they could actually, in theory, move together as they're bolted together. Okay, now moving on to the Sabaton. The rest of the knee pad armor would have just been finished off the same way as any other, just using shell modifier and then adding some edges and some rolled edges. Here we're just starting off with a simple box, and we're going to make the big wedge shape of the Sabaton, just making the large planar shapes the same way as we did in the concept. Just making sure the back of the box lines up with the ankle before extruding out. Now just adding in the basic shapes for the toe cap. Just adding the nice little curve under as it flares out from underneath the toe. It's always nice to add some little exaggerated rhythms to the armour, so you can see how the shin pad armour flows out in relation to the ankle bones. And they have a very basic forms, and we can start cutting in a few more, such as where the toes would pop out on the side. Here we're making sure the topology sits nicely together along the center of the foot, just to make it easier to cut out the panels later. Now just making sure the armour conforms slightly more to the foot itself. Just always remember your underlying anatomy and how the armour will fit around it. I'm just doing some Tesso Turbo Smooth, see what it's looking like. Currently it's looking a bit too boxy and simple, but we can rectify that by using some FFDs and adjust the shape. Here I'm deviating slightly from the concept mesh underneath. This will always happen. You'll generally find out a bit more as you're modeling. In this instance, the concept sculpt was actually a bit too blocky and simple, and I'm just exaggerating some of the curves and forms of the sabaton. Here I'm just cleaning up the topology to make sure it's ready for when we start segmenting off the panels. See here, I'm just cutting in the shapes right away, just doing it all by eye. It doesn't need to be perfectly spaced, like mathematically perfectly. It just needs to be spaced evenly. Just cutting out the back main panel of the leg, of the foot, as all the movement will be happening along the center and end of the foot. The back will just be generally quite still and locked into place. Now just doing the extrude technique to get that overlap with all the panels. There you go, it's looking a bit like an animal at the moment. Just doing some tests with Turbo Smooth, seeing what it's like. Here once again adding that swept back pattern as seen in the ends of multiple pieces of armor, like on the knee pad as we had just now, or the gauntlet finger armor. Now just using FFDs to bash it into a nicer shape. Now just extruding out the panels underneath so they fit nice and above each other. Now just adding some thickness to the panels to see if they overlap nicely and sit together. Since the back panel of the ankle will sort of hinge and then buckle on the inside, I'm just separating it in two here. So the knight could slip it on like a slipper and then hinge it on the back. Just adding some overlap. Just making sure only one side overlaps, as one side will be hinged and the other will be buckled over. Now adding that nice crease down the middle as seen on other parts of the armor. Again, making sure the shape language is unified. Now we can make it into a more natural foot shape, as the top was coming up a bit too high. We can do that just using FFDs. Okay, now the last part of the high poly is making all the buckles. Once we have all our armor panels connecting nicely and flowing together nicely, The last bit of detail we'll be modelling is the belts and buckles. So we're just going to start off with one high poly buckle. And when it comes to make these connecting pieces, it's best to spend a bit of time making sure they're looking pretty convincing. You don't want your armour to look as though it's not properly fastened together and attached to the body of the user. Once we get all these in, it'll really start getting a final look of our armour. When making these buckles, we want to make sure, like the rest of our armour, so they look as though they actually work, so we can make each individual piece with a separate pivot on each part so that we can angle them in place later. With the buckle on this set, it sort of protrudes out slightly and gives us a nice curve. Even though they're just a small part of the armour, you really don't want to rush them. You want to make sure they look as convincing as possible. Also want to make sure these buckles don't look too flimsy, as they're actually holding quite heavy plate armour together, and the user will be moving around and fighting in them, so he doesn't want his armour to just come off randomly during a battle. Just keep in mind the topology of your high poly buckle. Just make sure it'll be easier later to strip away and make a low poly out of it, as we'll be seeing this across the entire mesh. See, we're taking some time just to make sure the buckle looks as though it's actually clasping on top of it. It's definitely worth taking the time to make sure it looks as though it's all working together. Since this buckle is quite basic, we can keep it all being made in 3ds Max. If you're going for a more fancy buckle, I would suggest making the initial one in 3ds Max and then adding all the sculpting on top of it in ZBrush. The downside is you'll lose all the instancing that you'll be able to do, as ZBrush doesn't allow for that. Here we're just adding in some indents to suggest how the buckle will go in. This is just easier than doing it later in Substance. Right, now that our high poly pieces are done for the buckle, we can attach them all together and now move them into place. We want to still keep them separate meshes as they'll be adjusted when we start putting in these straps. Just making sure the scale of it is correct. It looks as though the knight would actually be able to fit their fingers around it and use it. Okay, now using 3ds Max's select and place, we can just slide the mesh across the armor, making sure the axis aligns with its pivot. I find it's a lot easier to do in Max rather than ZBrush, because you have a lot more control. Right, just starting off with the strap that goes around the thigh and to the back. Now just making an instance of this buckle, and that's what's going to be key to making our low poly and UVing a lot simpler later. Just instance small repeating details like this. Select and placing the buckle along the upper thigh armor. if designing your own armor, just make sure you have buckles along key places for it to attach. You don't want to overdo it, as you don't want an overkill of buckles on your armor, just enough to fasten it into place. Okay, now that we've got some buckles in place, we can start adding some straps. The way I like to make straps is just by starting with a simple plane and then shift extruding it along into place. Just adding the starts and ends. And then we can just add some control edges in the middle and then turbo smooth the whole shape into place. This is a lot easier and gives a lot more control rather than trying to mess around with splines, and the result is basically the same. Here we can just shift it around the buckle where it will be fastened to place. And we can have a nice curl out as the buckle would sort of fold out. Giving it a nice natural look. Just adding some control edges around where we want the bend to occur. When placing stuff like buckles or knots or any sort of small hand-done details like that, it's definitely worth having an actual real-life belt or shoelace near you, just so you can get a better sense of how to model this into place. So just adding in simple cuts along the belt and then turbo smoothing it all into place. Just making sure the belt is strapped down tight to the body itself. It's always important to make sure it looks as though it's actually fitted and lashed down to the body. A big gripe of mine is when I see floating belts on characters, it just takes me right out of it. It just doesn't look very realistic at all. It's always important to get that nice sense of just strapped down, someone's really buckled them tight in. Alright, and that's our high poly done. We've got all our belts and straps in and buckles. We've got all our rolled edges nicely done. Everything's conforming nicely to the body. It's all ready to go. You might notice he's missing a few things like engraving, embossing, bolts, denting, lots of stuff that will be done in ZBrush. Well, we're going to skip all that and move it all into Substance Painter, where we have a lot more control and it'll be a lot faster to do. But before we get into that, we've got to do all the low poly and baking, and that'll be next week. See you guys.